Now, at the beginning of that interview, we heard a little update from Dominic Raab about coronavirus. A small group of Britons who didn't make it onto the first evacuation flight out of China are now returning to the United Kingdom. Joining us from Leicester is the Shadow Heath Secretary, Jonathan Ashworth, to discuss the outbreak. So we're just hearing there about the second group of British nationals returning to the UK. We have also had the first confirmed cases of coronavirus in the United Kingdom. What do you make of the government's response?
Well, actually, unusually for me, Sophie, coming on your show, where I usually come on your show to attack an element of government weakness in policy, I'm actually going to praise NHS England and our public health specialists. I think they are doing all that they can in the circumstances. And obviously our thoughts today must go out to those who are on the plane, who are in quarantine, and those who have contracted the virus. But of course, all our brilliant NHS staff who are working around the clock on this issue. So unusually for me, I'm not going to sort of criticise or undermine the government efforts. I think they are doing everything they can be doing. I think probably they need to be a little bit quicker at getting information out, particularly in the areas, particularly in York, particularly on the Wirral. I know there are people concerned on the ground in the general public, but I think NHS England and our public health specialists have responded in the correct way to this.
Very unusual moment on a political interview show. I think you're probably right there. How worried do you think people in the UK should be about coronavirus? I just wonder if there's a risk of scaremongering. I mean, there's only 2 cases confirmed in the UK. The death rate for the infection is just 2%, far less than things like SARS or Ebola. Are we getting a bit over-concerned?
Well, I mean, we don't want scaremongering, but everyone should be vigilant. I mean, this is a very infectious virus. There's no question it's extremely infectious, more infectious than SARS, I believe. But the mortality rate is around 2%. In other words, 98% of people will survive this, and actually a lot of those people will have relatively mild symptoms. That is not to undermine the seriousness of it, and we should all remain vigilant, but that we don't need the sort of some of the scaremongering that we've seen in some of the newspapers about it. And I think the advice today that's come out from the NHS around washing your hands, disposing of tissues, being careful, is the correct advice. We all need to be vigilant because this has got some way to go yet. And as I say, it's extremely infectious, this virus, and we could see it spreading quite rapidly further, but we should just all remain vigilant.
You're focusing there on how infectious the virus is. As you say, it's an extremely infectious virus. Which just brings me to one of the images that I've struggled to kind of get out of my head in the coverage this week, which was those coaches bringing people from Wuhan to the health facilities where they'll be put in quarantine. The health workers were in full protective gear, but the drivers of those coaches were wearing ties and shirt sleeves. And the Sunday Times this morning saying that Horseman coaches apparently secured protective suits for the drivers, but were told categorically by the government that the drivers were not allowed to wear them. Are you a bit worried that the drivers of these coaches have perhaps been somewhat overlooked?
Well, I mean, I saw the photos, and I can see that the photos looked very alarming, didn't they? But actually, when you read it, when you look into it, the advice, the clinical advice, is that if the drivers had worn the protective suits, that could have caused them problems in driving. And they thought, on the balance of probabilities, it was more important that they could drive the coaches well and not have any accidents on the coaches. So look, all these things we have to take the medical advice on. And I don't think, or I've not seen any evidence that government officials or health officials are not following the medical advice.
OK, thank you very much for that. I'm keen to move on to Brexit now. First programme post our membership of the European Union. You, of course, campaigned to remain. So what were you doing on 11 p.m. on Friday night? Were you drowning your sorrows? Oh, I was in bed. I like to be in bed about 10:30 at most nights. So I was neither celebrating or drowning my sorrows. I was just getting on with my life. How are you feeling about the departure? But it's happened now. Well, it's happened, hasn't it? I mean, I was a Remainer, this part of the world where I'm stood today, voted Remain, but Leave won. And now I hope this division between Leavers and Remainers can come to an end, and we just can pull together again and move on. That means we've still got to scrutinise the government, and we're still sceptical about some of Boris Johnson's grand claims about what he's going to be able to deliver in this post-Brexit world.
But the issue itself has been settled now. We've just got to make the best of it.
We spoke to the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, ahead of your interview. Boris Johnson is going to be setting out his vision for our post-Brexit relationship with the EU tomorrow. It's pretty clear that they want lots of divergence. They don't want to be aligning too much with the European Union. Are you worried about what this looser relationship could look like?
Well, presumably tomorrow he announces 350 million extra a week for the NHS, of course. Look, we will see what he has to say. We think it's important that we have a close relationship with Europe. We don't want to see any watering down of the environmental standards, the workplace rights that we've won, the consumer rights that we've won over many years through our membership of the European Union. But we'll see what he says. And I know that Boris Johnson has a thumping great majority in the House of Commons. How could I not know that? But that doesn't mean we won't hold him to account. That doesn't mean we won't put him under careful scrutiny. And he's made some big promises to the British people, not just on Brexit. He's promised us 40 new hospitals, 50,000 new nurses, for example. We will be holding him to account on each and every one of the promises he made to the British people in that recent general election.
But if he does deliver on that in some of those red wall seats in the Midlands, in the north of England, then Labour can have a real fight trying to regain them.
Well, yes, and the next general election, when it comes, is going to be a difficult general election. I mean, we got thumped, didn't we? We got absolutely smashed in that general election. We lost seats like North West Durham, like Bolsover, seats we've held forever, and seats that we thought we were going to gain, where we'd pioneered new campaigning techniques, like Mansfield, like Hastings. We went even further backwards. So Labour has a problem, and it's partly because the structure of the Labour vote has been changing over 10 years. We still do extremely well in cities like the one I represent, in university towns, in areas which are very diverse. Yet in our very traditional areas, but Bolton, Bury, Bolsover and North West Durham, we've lost seats and gone backwards. This is going to be a hard few years for the Labour Party to win people's trust again.
It's interesting they're talking about the performance in the election, because you saw it coming, didn't you? There was a leaked recording of you just before the election where you said it's dire for Labour outside of the city seats, it's abysmal out there, they can't stand Corbyn, and they think Labour's blocked Brexit. So you were right all along.
Well, I mean, the tragedy of that phone call isn't the personal embarrassment it caused me by being sort of manipulated by a former friend.
But you were right on the substance.
Well, indeed, the general election result was much worse than my exaggerated attempts to placate a former friend on a phone call. I mean, we lost seats like North West Durham and Bolsover, which have been Labour through and through forever. And as I say, it is partly because the structure of the Labour vote, our core vote, has been changing over 10 years. This hasn't happened overnight. We lost Scotland in 2015. Many sort of former coal mining areas actually went in 2010. I mean, Sherwood is a Nottinghamshire coal mining seat, and there's no pits anymore, of course, but was a Nottinghamshire coal mining seat. We lost that by 200 votes in 2010. In this last election, we lost it by about 16,000 votes. So these trends have been happening for some time, but the challenge for Labour is how do we maintain our strength in cities like Leicester and inner city London and in university towns, while rebuilding in Bury, in Bolton, in Bolsover and North West Durham. That is the challenge for our candidates who are running for leader.
You say that some of those problems for Labour have been a long time coming, but some of them were more recent. Some of them were mistakes around the election campaign as well. And one of those people very closely associated with that campaign is Carrie Murphy, Jeremy Corbyn's chief aide. Also has bullying allegations against her that she denies, her lawyer denies very strenuously. Is it right that she's been nominated for a peerage?
Well, it's the prerogative of the leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn,
but is it
to put
right?
Forward who he think. Well, I mean, it's, all leaders put forward who they want to put forward, but there will be I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of these allegations, but there's always a process. There's a vetting process, so it's an independent process that will look at these issues, and that independent process will make a decision on whether the people on that list will go in. By the way, I have no idea who Jeremy Corbyn has actually put in. I'm just assuming that the names that have been in the media are the ones he's put in, by the way. But there will be an independent process which will look into all of these allegations.
Now, looking ahead to the Labour leadership race, you're supporting Lisa Nandy's candidacy to be the next Labour leader. Can't help but notice that she's the only person in the race still who wasn't a member of the Shadow Cabinet. Does that mean you think it's time for a break from the Corbyn project?
Well, I think the policy agenda that we put forward the last election was the correct agenda, because the challenge for Labour is I've talked about these problems we've got between our city areas and our university towns and our traditional heartlands. But when you look at the challenges facing people in those areas, in both areas the universal credit is seeing child poverty rise. In both areas people have got difficulty accessing good schools, a good NHS, difficulty accessing good housing. They want their streets to be safer. And we actually put forward a set of policies which would meet those challenges in both areas. So when you say a break from the Corbyn era, you know, that's a sort of, I don't mean it to be rude to you, but a slightly simplistic way of looking at it. The policies we put forward, I think, are a good set of policies. Now, over the next few years, we'll have to develop policies for the 2025 to 2030 period. So some of the individual items may not stay in the manifesto because we're dealing with the second half of this decade. But I think broadly, policies which are anti-austerity, which are about investing in public services, which are about delivering economic justice, a fairer taxation system, they're the correct policies we need to be putting to the British people in the coming years.
If the policies are the right ones, why is it then that you're backing the one candidate who wasn't in the Shadow Cabinet, who wasn't part of drawing them up?
Because I think, well, Lisa Nandy used to be in the Shadow Cabinet, and actually when she was in the Shadow Cabinet, began the development,
and then she resigned.
Of a lot of our a lot of our green policies. I mean, we talked today about the Green New Deal, and I remember Lisa Nandy talking about this stuff 5 years ago because she was ahead of the curve on it. But look, you know, I mean, I'm supporting Lisa Nandy because I think she was one of the first to recognise these problems in our traditional areas before perhaps some others did in the Labour Party, and was talking about that. But look, you know, I wouldn't say that just because she's, you know, if one of the others won, for example, I would support one of the others as well. I'm not going to say, well, they were in the Shadow Cabinet, so they can't be the leader of the Labour Party. Well, fundamentally, though, the members will decide this. It's not really up to me. It's up to the members, and they'll consider all these candidates very carefully.
You talked there about Lisa Nandy being one of the first people to articulate that break, perhaps, between what Labour's traditional voters wanted in some of the working class areas and some of the towns in particular. Do you think the Labour Party has become too metropolitan, perhaps a bit too liberal?
Well, I'm not sure what that actually means, because they're slightly pejorative terms, or can be interpreted as slightly pejorative terms. It's certainly true that the Labour Party is very strong in cities and metropolitan areas and has become very weak in suburbs and towns and former industrial areas, and that is the challenge for us in the coming years. How do we hold on to Leicester, to Nottingham, to inner city London, to Liverpool, while winning back Bury and Bolton and Hastings and Swindon? I mean, that is a big challenge, and something that is going to involve a lot of hard work over the next few years.
OK, Jonathan Ashworth, thank you very much for being on the programme this morning. Thank you.